Just tell me if it's if you can't hear me. So let's see.
Velkommen til dette eventet her med Stephen Barstow, som har kommet fra nord og vil holde et spennende foredrag om flerårige grønnsaker for oss. Veldig glad for at du kunne komme og gjøre det. Og veldig herlig at det er så mange som har stilt opp i dag, på glatt føre og dårlig kjøreforhold. Så vi har ingen inngangsbetaling til dette foredraget, men veldig hyggelig om folk legger en liten gave til Steven ute i den hvite boksen som står på bordet her ute. Det er også mulig å kjøpe Stevens bok, Around the World in 80 Plants, som ligger der ute, og informasjon. Enten kan du betale kontant, eller og da er det en annen boks. Og så er det mulig å vipse, og det er mulig å sette over på din konto. Ja. Så tusen hjertelig takk for at du vil komme.
Ja, ok, og tusen takk til Derek. Yeah, I've been asked to do this one in English. Yesterday I was in Hamar. We had a mostly Norwegian audience, but today there's quite a few foreigners here, so I've been asked to do this one in English. And I think it's also being streamed live to the whole world, you know? So this is really around the world talk today. Yes, fantastic that there's so many people turned up today. Yeah, something about myself first. I come originally from England. I was born in southern England. I studied in Scotland, and I moved gradually further and further north. And when I was in Scotland, I started getting interested in vegetable growing when I was a student. I had a small garden, and in 1981, I started looking for jobs, and there were no jobs in the UK at the time. There was somebody called Maggie Thatcher who was closing all the research institutes, so I call myself a political refugee. So I moved to Norway as I say, in 1981. Very quickly got a job here mainly because of the boom in the oil industry in the 70s. I was qualified actually as an oceanographer. I specialise in ocean waves. I have nothing at all to do with plants in my education. In fact, I gave up biology when I was 15 because I didn't like cutting up rats in the classroom. So absolutely no, I'm totally unqualified for this. This is all just hands-on stuff. I'm a gardener. Yeah, so I came to Norway in 1981. In the late 70s, I got caught up in the kind of green wave in the UK, and as I say, I started growing my own vegetables. I became a vegetarian, and then I moved to Norway, which is a big shock for me because I moved to a country where it seemed that vegetables were illegal. There really were no more than 4 or 5 vegetables in the supermarket. People told me that the reason for this was it was so damn cold in Trondheim, where I've lived all my life since then. Yeah, and I think I've disproved that now because today in my garden I have over 2,000 different edible plants. So there's no, and in fact I believe where I live in my part of the world, we have perfect conditions for growing vegetables. There's nowhere else in the world that's better than Trondheim. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, there's never drought, you know, perfect. Yeah. Do you believe me? Yeah. Yeah.
How big is your plot?
My plot is it's about 40 by 50 meters. It's not huge.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I don't have many of each plant. Yeah. It's very intensive. Yeah. But we shouldn't just. You can't just copy what the rest of the world does, and think that you could start growing chilies and tomatoes and things like that, because that doesn't go. But there are thousands of other plants, potential plants that we can grow in be talking about that today. You perhaps noticed I've got some letters after my name. In the UK, we like to have lots of letters after a name. The Fellow of the Royal Society of blah blah blah, PhD or whatever. ESM, anybody know what that stands for? I know one person who does because she was in Harmer yesterday. No, it stands for Extreme Salad Man. Yeah, because some years ago, 13 years ago, in 2003, I set the world record in salad making. So making a salad with 538 different edible plants in one salad bowl. Yeah, absolutely crazy, but why did I do it? Because I could do it, basically. It was a gimmick to attract attention to them. I was part of the Organic Gardening Network in Norway at the time, and we had an annual open day. And to attract attention to the event, we decided to advertise we're going to break the world record in salad making. Yeah.
Guinness Book of Records?
It's not in the Guinness Book of Records. For one reason, they refused to take it because they didn't have a category for this. And I'm quite glad that I didn't get in there, because at the time it was all about recording how fat and how big, etc. It wasn't to do with diversity and organic things, ecological things. So I kind of joked for a number of years, we really need, Guinness is a brewery originally.
Yes.
We really need an organic brewery that's interested in putting out a record book for meaningful records,
Yes.
not for not everything to do with greed, etc. Okay, so a little introduction. Yeah, I usually show this to my audience. I travel quite a lot around the world talking, and not many people know where Trondheim is. I live in a little place called Malvik, which is about 18 kilometres north of Trondheim, or next to the Trondheim fjord. So, yeah, it's kind of a bit surprising that probably the largest collection of edible plants in the world is to be found at 64.5 degrees north, and it always surprises people. And hopefully you'll understand a bit more about how this is possible as we proceed. It's not just that I'm a collectomania, or samlermani in Norwegian. My dad collects stamps, so I had to find something to collect. It's in my genes, and it ended up being edible plants. So, sorry. Something about the inspirations I had underway. As I say, I moved to Norway. People told me it was difficult to grow vegetables where I was. And actually in the same year that I moved to Norway, in 1981, there was formed a local group of the Norwegian Useful Plant Society, Nyttevekstforening, in Trondheim, so lokallaget. And this guy here, Jan Erik Korfeld, is a bit of a hero of mine. He's been in the on the board, on the steering committee of the local group right the way from the beginning in the early 1980s. And I remember the first spring I was out on a foraging tour down on the beach near my house, and I very quickly learned that there was something like 60 wild edible plants just in the local area where I live. A huge diversity of food plants. Not all were good to eat. Some of them were really in the emergency food category. You'd have to be absolutely desperate to try. But all these plants have been used over the years in different parts of the world. Yeah. So this was a kind of, it was really strange, because the supermarkets had nothing, and then there was this group of, at the time, 20-year-olds who had also been inspired by alternative thinking in the 1970s, all in their 20s, and they started up this local group, and they were eating a huge array of different vegetables. So it was a huge contrast. Of course, berries and mushrooms as well in the autumn. Yeah.
how, you say you found 60 different types quickly, how does that compare with Scotland?
Oh yeah, probably about the same. Yeah, yeah, Scotland. You from Scotland? Yeah.
No,
Oh, no, okay. Oh, compared to where I came. Well, I knew very little about. I was kind of beginning when I was a student in Scotland, so I did mostly gardening and started learning the wild plants. But I didn't know. I knew the wild mushrooms, a few, but not edible greens. And as I mentioned, I've worked as an oceanographer. I actually gave in my resignation at work. Well, this is going live. I don't think many of my work colleagues know this, but I gave my resignation in a couple of days ago, and I will become a pensioner, the inverted commas, at the end of April, to work 100% with plants. So this is quite fun for me. And as I actually worked, I worked as an oceanographer, and as I say, with ocean waves. And in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we had an amazing project where we were mapping the wave energy resources of the South Pacific Islands from Trondheim. Yeah, it was a NORAD finance project. The idea of replacing diesel fuel for energy in the South Pacific Islands with energy from the waves. Because at that time the Norwegian or the Sintef and the University in Trondheim were world leaders in the technology for extracting energy from the waves. And this entailed, we did measurements of the waves with ocean-going moored buoys that moored in the ocean, go up and down and measured the waves. And I was working mainly, I was giving courses on ocean wave energy together with a professor at the University in Trondheim in various islands in the South Pacific. So I usually had to go down to Fiji and the Cook Islands and places like this, usually in November. I was thinking of leaving Trondheim in November. You know,
how disgusting.
Yeah, how disgusting. But I did it, and in the process, of course, I had to travel around the world. And as I was already inspired by local foraging traditions, I started buying books on foraging traditions in other parts of the world, wondering, you know, what other plants could be possibly grown in where I live. And one book was a big inspiration. I remember buying in Seattle on a tour to the south, on a stopover, was this book here, Sturtevant's Edible Plants of the World. It's a book which was put together, or a database that was put together by an American professor between 1870 and 1920. And it was published after his death. And it's basically masses of information, no pictures, just masses of information on how almost 3,000 different species of edible plants are used around the world. And I started looking in this book, and I found, to my surprise, that there were actually many of the plants that I already had in my garden, which I was growing as ornamentals, were actually food. And we'll see some examples of that fairly soon. But I started going through this book and crossing off, well, that could be interesting to try, and that could be interesting to try, etc. Yeah.
What's edible?
What is edible?
Species.
Species, yeah. Sorry, yeah. Another database which was actually put together by a guy called Ken Fern, who was a bus driver in London. He got fed up with driving buses and he moved out into the country, and he got really inspired, again, similar to me, with the world's foraging traditions. And he went even further, and he was much worse than me. He put together this database in the early 1990s with over 7,000 plants. Not only the edibility, everything you can do with these plants. So you use for dyeing, for medicine, etc., etc. And this database is still freely available on the internet, so you can just seek information on these plants. And I guess I'm probably the biggest user of that over the years, because in 1992 he sent me the entire database on 10 of these old diskettes, and he didn't want any money for it either. You know, I supported his charity afterwards, but yeah, he was an amazing guy. He still is. But my real my Bible for edible plants, I always have it with me wherever I am, is this book here, Cornucopia 2, a Sourcebook of edible plants. And as you can see, I've worn out one completely. It's not that easy to get hold of, unfortunately, but Amazon had 20 whole brand new copies available 2-3 years ago, so I was one of the lucky ones that got those. And no, actually, it did come out. It was republished in North America, but you can only be bought in North America. Well, outside, so you've got to know somebody over there to get it. Anyway, as you can see, it's just masses of information of the world's edible plants. Real fascinating stuff. So when I was learning about this stuff, you know, I take it to bed with me, and as I was travelling quite a lot, I often would go to botanical gardens, and this is how I learned the plants. I went around botanical gardens with my book here, saw the label, looked it up, and learned. So this happened this was over several years, and within this book here, in the introduction, it says that this is in Norwegian here, but I'll translate it into English. It says, of the world's 15,000 edible plant species, there are only around about 150 which are cultivated commercially. So there's actually very few. Most of them are actually perennials. They're not annuals. Most of our annuals are biennials. Most of our conventional vegetables fall into that category. In actual fact, he was way off the mark here. According to my current estimates, I think there are something like 100,000 edible plants in the world. Huge number. Maybe 1/3 of all the species in the world have been used for food at some stage. From my point of view, living in Trondheim, there's been a massive increase in the availability of vegetables in the supermarkets. So maybe I can buy 30 now if I ever went to a supermarket. Of course, I don't need to, but so there's maybe 30 now. But probably on a global basis, in that same 30-year period from when I moved to Trondheim to now, there's actually been a decrease in the number of vegetables which are grown commercially on a big scale. But it's the same species which are sold globally, anytime, anywhere. Okay? So asparagus, for example, which to me is it's a spring vegetable. Asparagus, the name asparagus means spring shoot. Okay? But nowadays we can buy asparagus anytime, practically anywhere, because it's produced on a big scale in Peru, China. It's all part of this global system that we have today. And that's a great shame. I think it's very much underestimated the seasonality of food in our diets. Yeah, that's very, very important for us also mentally. Something to look forward to in the spring. You know? Yeah, there are positive developments, but maybe in the last few years there's been a positive upswing again, thanks to the farmers' markets and small-scale local production again, and some old vegetables coming back again. Yeah. So that was that. And around about 10 years ago now, well, 15 years ago, I started writing articles based on my trial and experiences with growing many of these plants in my own garden in Nyttevek, outside of Trondheim, and that's actually a view from my garden over the Trondheim fjord, just to give you a kind of a location. And yeah, so what was I going to say?
10 years ago.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, 15 years ago I started writing articles for the for Nyttevekstforening, which is the magazine of the Norwegian Useful Plant Society, on some of the more exciting plants that I kind of discovered, which were fairly unknown in Norway at the time. After that, about 10 years ago, I started writing in English for the for Permaculture magazine in the UK, and I started writing. I wrote 3 or 4 articles about some of my favourite perennial vegetables, and they then asked me whether I was maybe interested in writing a book with. So I'd written 3 or 4 profiles of plants, and would you be interested in writing a book? And actually, at the time, I was already started doing talks, and I called I was calling my talks around the world in 80 species, edible plants, and the first one was about 10 years ago for the Norwegian Botanical Society in Trondheim. So I said I'd already had the thought myself that maybe it'd be fun to write a book about this, and so I said yes. It took me a long time to write because I had a full-time job. I was doing it in the evenings. So it took about 6 years to do. But it finally came out 3 years ago, around the world in 80 plants. The book and also the talks that I do on this subject are basically journeys around the world, looking at my 80 favourite perennial vegetables, which I grow in my garden outside of Trondheim. And basically there are 80 plant profiles, and each one I cover the history behind the plants, how they were used locally and where they originate, how you would grow them, and how you would use them in the kitchen. In actual fact, there are probably several hundred plants which are mentioned in the book, but there are 80 main ones. And in the book, the journey starts in London and ends in London, of course, with the Around the World in 80 concept. But today, and also yesterday, I'm starting in Japan, because that's an area that I'm really fascinated about at the moment. There are still probably 1,000 different edible plants that I haven't tried that come from Japan. So I'm going to start today in Japan. We're going to fly across the Pacific to South America, North America, and across to Scandinavia, down through Central Europe, through the Mediterranean countries to the Caucasus, to the Himalaya, and finally ending up in Siberia again. Okay? But first of all, something about these perennial vegetables. Again, the slide is in Norwegian, but I'll translate it into English as we go along. Why do I think that we should be growing more perennials than today? There are various reasons. Traditionally, one would use, the wild foraged vegetables that we harvest in the springtime. Plants like nettles, nestle, skvallerkål, God forbid, or ground elder in English. They are all perennial plants, right? And we harvest them in the springtime. So it's the kind of opposite to the traditional vegetables that we're harvesting in the autumn. Traditionally, this spring harvest would complement the traditional vegetables. In Norwegian, I turn things around, and this doesn't make sense in English, but I talk about not in-husting, I talk about in-voring vegetables. If you say it enough times, then it actually begins to sit. It sounds a bit funny to start with, but invårade grönsaker. Anyway, other reasons for growing perennials is that if you think about it, the nettles and the ground elder or the spring harvested forage vegetables, they're they're perfect. There's no insect holes or anything like that. So there are fewer, because there are fewer insects and other fungi attacks and this kind of thing in the springtime. Less snails and slugs and this kind of thing. So the spring harvest is so it's much easier to grow these perennials organically. Okay, many of us, I can say now, many of us have big problems with growing brassicas, for example, the cabbage family, because of this. Remember last year we had this massive attack of the cornmeal or diamondback moth, which caused huge problems and is causing bigger and bigger problems. But actually, the kale, the cabbage family, was originally perennial and was harvested in the springtime. And we'll come back to that later because we can still change things around and grow kales for spring harvest rather than autumn harvest. Another thing is there's less need for irrigation or water for these perennials because their active growth period is from very early spring, April to midsummer. In that period, after the winter season, there's usually enough water in the soils. There's no drought problems. There's less need for fertilizer because the roots of the perennials, they go much deeper and they're much more efficient at sucking up the available nutrients in the soil. Many of my best perennials actually never get any fertilizer at all. They just get what nature brings. Another very important thing that it's less work. It's like the ultimate no-dig gardening. Because the plants just come back of themselves year after year after year. And that's very important in a future where we're seeing climate change and there's not going to be as much oil in the future. It's much better. It makes much more sense to grow perennials in an era with less energy available, at least to me. And what else can we say? So actually, back to climate again. Most of these perennials generally are much more robust against climate change as well. With climate change, we're seeing these large swings in the climate. So one year you might get really cold weather. 2 years ago we had the coldest spring ever in my part of the world, in Trondheim. The farmers had big problems to come out and sow and plant right the way up to midsummer. I had the biggest yields ever in my garden from my perennials at the same time. So it's the complete opposite. And if suddenly there's a cold period comes or a really bad weather, the perennials just stop and wait until the good weather comes. So you still get a yield, just a bit later. So they're much less sensitive to climate change. Many of the species that I'll be talking about today, they actually grow best in woodland, in shady conditions. Most of our traditional vegetables we grow right out in the sun. But actually, many or most plants originated in woodland conditions. So they actually could be planted in places where you wouldn't dream today of growing vegetables, like on the north side of your house. And here we get into the concept that's become very popular within permaculture of forest gardening, Skogshagen. I'll show you a slide about that in a minute. Yeah, another thing is that many of the plants many of these perennials, they actually double as ornamental plants. So you can actually take the first leaves that spring out in the springtime for food, and they'll resprout and they'll still flower in the same season. So actually many of the ornamentals that you grow in your gardens are actually edible plants, and we'll see various examples of that as we go along. And here I had to introduce the concept of edimentals, which stands for edible ornamentals, or in Norwegian, prudsaker, prude grønnsaker. So this combination I'm particularly fond of, and trying to persuade ornamental gardeners that it's very easy for them to change to edible gardening because they've already got half of their, or a third of their plants are edible. Another thing is that it's turning out more and more that these perennials actually have a higher nutrient content compared to traditional ones, and particularly wild foraged plants. We see quite a few analyses showing that the nutrient content is higher than the vegetables we buy in the supermarket. Also related to climate is less erosion. Your top is decreased. We can actually increase some perennials. You can harvest over most of the summer, but other ones have a very intensive collection season early in the spring. And to increase the harvesting season, you can actually move the roots indoors and extend the season that way, force them indoors or in a greenhouse or whatever. This is a practice which is carried out worldwide, actually. And I think that perennials are particularly advantageous in areas with short seasons. And here I'm thinking in Norway, well, most people that I speak to outside of Norway think that I've got a very short season, because within Norway we have go up into the mountain villages or into northern Norway. They have very short seasons and cool conditions. And these kind of conditions are perfect for perennials because they start growing very early in the springtime, okay, and they kind of use the available sun energy throughout the season in an optimal way. So compared to traditional vegetables, which take quite some time before they start producing, perhaps it's July before they really start getting big and start growing. The perennials are using the whole season, and in that way we can actually get very high yields of leafy green vegetables, even in northern Norway and in the mountain villages. Think Angelica, Kvam, okay, huge plant. Tromsø palm, we call it in English, but huge plant. Lots of, you know, how does that happen? You know, I mean, how? Yeah, you can do it, you know, but you have to choose the right species. And in fact, Tromsø palm is an edible plant in Iran. It's a very important spring vegetable, and they also use the seeds as a spice. Until recently, they weren't aware of this in Tromsø, but actually they've got a huge food resource there all over the city, where it's a naturalised plant. We'll maybe come back to that a bit later. Okay, so that was some of the justification for what I do. And it's actually within the this whole thing about using, yeah, and the perennials, of course, they bind more carbon in the soil compared to the traditional vegetables, which is also important. And it's even within this climatic advice from Norsk Landbruksrådgivning, or the agricultural advice centre, or whatever they're called, that it's important for maintaining carbon in the soil to have a ground cover. Of course, they're not talking about vegetables here, but it's exactly the same argument. You can find that on the internet if you want to read more. I talked a little bit about forest gardening, which is particularly inspiring these days to people who are inspired by permaculture, which I guess many of you have heard of. Anybody here heard of permaculture? Yeah, quite a few, I think. And well, the original permaculture anyway was in the original permaculture, which was mainly focused on agriculture and growing food. One tried to set up systems which replicated nature in some way. And one of the concepts within permaculture is this forest gardening, where instead of creating a traditional open vegetable plot in your garden, you maybe you make a kind of a small, like a young, edible forest. We're composed of different layers. Highest up you have fruit trees and nut trees. Then lower down you got currant bushes, etc. Maybe on the southern side of the sunny side of the forest you can grow some of your traditional vegetables as well. But within the forest you have shade-loving perennial edibles, some of which will climb up into the trees. And you'll see many of these are in my book and also in the talk we'll come into as we go along. Yeah. There are very few today recognized perennial vegetables. The one that I've just put a few up here, the most well known, of course, is asparagus, which is, as I mentioned, just means spring shoot. And along with that, the other one we can often buy in supermarkets is artichoke, which, unlike most of the perennial vegetables I'm talking about, it's not usually the spring shoots which are being used. You can actually use the spring shoots of artichokes as well as food, but it's actually the receptacle of the flower, the lower part of the flower, which is the part that we eat. So that's harvested a bit later in the season compared to the spring shoots. Nowadays, artichokes are actually mainly grown annually in places like California, where they've got such a climate that they can grow several crops on the same piece of land throughout the season. So they have new varieties of artichoke which grow very quickly, and they don't take the benefit of the perenniality. And of course artichokes are not terribly hardy, but they were formerly grown in Norway. There's an old variety called Herregårds, and there was a couple of others which were actually grown for the king back in the old days, mainly in southern Norway. What?
What was the name of the old?
One of them's called Herregårds. Yeah, it's also found in Denmark, and so it's becoming available again. And I've also included rhubarb, because rhubarb, we think of it as a fruit, but it's only really been a fruit since sugar has become really popular. And rhubarb is, it is actually a perennial vegetable. If you go back and see where, and look at the wild species, all the wild species of rhubarb were harvested by local people for food. And it was used as a vegetable. Sugar wasn't available. They used it as a vegetable in various dishes. It was also fermented, for example. So originally, even in Europe, when rhubarb came to Europe first in the 16th century, it was used as a vegetable and a medicinal plant. So it was only in the last couple of 100 years we started using it to fill the hungry gap in the springtime of fruit. So when the fruit was gone from the storage, we went over to rhubarb in the springtime. Okay. I've also included this picture here. You know what this is? Picture of? It's a very common pepper root, horseradish in full flower. Beautiful plant, and edimental for me, yeah. And fully edible. And I've included it. My book's mainly about leafy green vegetables, but it's horseradish, of course, is mainly used for it's mainly the roots which are used for pepper root sauce in Norwegian, and horseradish sauce. Also an important ingredient in wasabi. Yeah.
Fake.
It is wasabi. Yeah, fake. Yeah. And but actually, in parts of Europe, it was also traditional to harvest the young shoots of horseradish as a vegetable. And the flowers are also really tasty, so try it. But don't eat a lot of them, they're quite strong. But mixed, they're excellent. Okay, now I should actually have my We haven't actually said we're having a break at some time, Derek? Decide. Okay, so I can keep them here. Brilliant. Power. Okay, so now we're going to start on the journey and start looking at some of the plants. And as I mentioned, actually last spring I was on a study trip to Japan. It's an area that really fascinates me because, as I mentioned here, both in Japan, Korea, China, all these countries, foraging was a hugely important tradition. And in particular, Japan is one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. In other words, in Japan there are over 2,000 endemic plants that are only found in Japan. So there's a huge number of wild species there. And these traditions for foraging in Japan, these vegetables are called sansai, and in Korea they're called samamu, which literally means mountain vegetables, so vegetables that were taken down from the mountain. And these days, people have moved from the mountain villages into the cities. The cities are getting bigger and bigger, and of course the people, they remember that fantastic food they had in the mountain villages, and particularly the wild foraged food that they had in the springtime. So there's a market for these wild vegetables, and therefore they, in recent years, in many parts of the world, they've started cultivating the wild vegetables near the big cities for the markets, often in greenhouses for whole year production, actually. And that was one of the reasons for my trip to Japan. After the trip, I found this book, which is like this Cornucopia too, but it's in Japanese. Luckily, there's an index with the botanical Latin names for everything there, so I can. So I'm still, if anybody knows how to scan and translate Japanese to English, so that I can put it into Google Translate, then talk to me afterwards. I think it is possible. At the moment, I have to ask various Japanese-speaking Facebook friends for help in the translation. I'm getting it. It's a lot of information in here. Yeah. So let's get on to the first plant, and this is Hosta, also called Aralia in Norwegian. One of the most popular garden plants we have. Very, very hardy. We can grow it more or less up over the whole country. And if you think about it, the big-leaved hostas, they have a huge amount of leaf production every year. So if you realise that, well, this is actually food, and it's not just an ornamental plant that you have in your garden, then you suddenly have a huge crop to pick every year. Because hostas, all hostas are actually edible. There are no known poisonous substances in hostas. So if you're sure it's a hosta, then you can safely eat it in the springtime. It actually took me many years before I dared to try it, because there have been written quite a lot of books about oriental vegetables right the way from the 1970s, but for some reason they missed hosta in these books. So as far as I know, my book is the first which really discusses hosta for food in the West. And it's basically the main part you harvest is the young shoots before the leaves begin folding out. You can take all the young shoots if you wish, and it will reshoot and flower in the same season. So you'll still have the ornamental aspect. So this is a real fantastic, productive edimental. And as I say, it took me many years before I dared to try it. What actually got me to try it eventually was that in North America they have a big society, the American Hosta Society. with 20,000 members. And there are 20,000 different types of Hosta as well, different cultivars, mainly grown for the leaves, which are often variegated and they look very attractive. And Hosta is grown also often in very shady conditions. Hosta doesn't need any sunlight at all in the season. Not direct sunlight anyway. And the American Hosta Society, they had an annual meeting with a big dinner, and one of their number knew about Hosta for food. And they prepared various dishes for the people at this big meeting. And afterwards, the comments were put out on their website, so people were commenting, "Well, that was really surprisingly tasty," you know, etc., etc. And then I dared try, because I saw all these people really like the taste, and other people were trying it, so I tried. I was expecting some kind of bitterness, but actually I never detected bitterness in Hosta. Very mild, good taste. You can use it raw. You can also use it as a kind of a spinach. You can also use the flowers. In Japan, they have a special variety, and it's mainly the large-leaved hostas, Hosta siboldiana, Hosta montana, which are used just because of their size, their volume. They're more productive. And Hosta montana, they blanch in darkened greenhouses for the markets. Blanching, so keep the sunlight away. So they move the roots into the greenhouses, and then in the darkness, the young shoots grow up almost totally white. Here I've just used, this is for my garden, and I've just had a bucket over it from the very early spring. And they call these literally Hosta icicles, East Topper, because they're white. This one's not totally white. I'll show you another picture in a minute. One of the first dishes I made, inspired by, you can find lots of recipes on the net these days if you look for Hosta and recipe. This was just, I cooked up the leaves very, very, very quickly, and then it was marinated in a sesame oil, soy sauce, a little salt mix, and it's delicious. Used as a salad. There are many recipes. You can also use the flower stalk. It's really crispy tasting. Of course, then you don't get the flour. And then when I wrote an article about Hosta in Permaculture magazine, again about 8 years ago now, and I made a comment that the guy that has this garden here has the biggest forest garden in the UK. You know who owns this place? Sorry? Not the Queen. Related? Prince Charles, yeah. This is Prince Charles's forest garden at Highgrove in the UK. Well, when I wrote the article, he didn't realise this at the time, that he had the biggest forest garden in the UK, but he's very into organic. Everything's grown organically there without pesticides or anything. Fantastic. He supported the organic movement in the UK right from the beginning. But within this forest here, he has the National Collection of Large-Leaved Hostas. So that wood there is absolutely full of food. And 2 years ago, I did a talk for the UK Walled Garden Society. Do you know what a walled garden is? It's like you know, all the big houses in the UK, they have a huge wall around where they grow the vegetables to make for a better climate. Anyway, there's a society that meet every year, and I was invited to give a talk, and I mentioned the Prince, and I showed exactly this picture here. Little did I know that two of Prince Charles's gardeners were actually in the audience. So they came up to me afterwards, and I very quickly signed a book and said, "Give it to the Prince, you know. If he wants to know anything about growing, you know, using Hosta for food, then please contact me." So it ended up last summer. I was invited to Highgrove to talk to the head gardener and one of the chefs about growing, about using Hosta in the kitchen. unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to take any pictures. It's a high security area, so but I did find, I think, one which shows what it looks like in there. Is that? Yeah, here you can see, this is a picture. It's called the scrubbery, I think it's called. It's basically large rotting trunks, and in between there are all these huge hosta plants growing, all different types. Fascinating to look at. And then I was in Japan, and right enough, all the supermarkets I visited there had hosta for sale. This was the end of April, beginning of the end of March, beginning of April. And this is the blanched icicles.
Did you take away the right for the taste of the vegetable?
Yeah, it'd be a slightly sweeter taste, I suppose. And also the way the food looks is very important for the Japanese. So it's yeah. So they're into flowers as well. So yeah, so very popular food there. Yeah, pop over next one. There is one confusion species, which is a confusion species if you're picking hosta from nature in Japan, in the Far East. Nyttevekstforening, or it's called false hellebore in English, veratrum, can be confused quite easily with hosta if you're not thinking. And this is a very poisonous plant, so you've got to be aware. And veratrum is actually, we have a Norwegian species which grows in Finnmark, but it's actually quite easy to tell the difference from the leaves. Veratrum, if you look at the nerves of the leaves, they go all the way from the tip right down to the base. With hosta, they just go part of the way. See? So be absolutely sure that it's hosta. If you're going, because sometimes Nyttevekstforening or veratrum is actually grown as an ornamental in Norwegian gardens. So you could potentially make a nasty error if you pick the wrong thing. Okay? The first time I asked my family to be guinea pigs and try hosta for the first time, and we made one of the dishes that they actually made at this big hosta meeting in the US was what they called hosta copita. Now, spanakopita is spinach pie, Greek spinach pie. You can buy it on all the street corners in Greece. Okay, so I just used a spinach pie, a spanakopita recipe you can all find on the net, and replaced the spinach with hosta leaves. And actually, they all ate it and they enjoyed it and said, "Yeah, we'll have that again." So.
And they survived.
And they survived as well, importantly. My daughter was very interested in making sushi for a period. This is hosta leaves in the sushi from a Japanese recipe. There are loads of recipes and ways of using hosta out there. And then we come on to my largest vegetable. And I mentioned that we had this very cold summer 2 years ago. This was the size that this plant had reached in the middle of June, in the coldest spring ever outside of Trondheim. And for most people, where I live is the Arctic, you know? So they're surprised. This is, I introduce you to Udo. I have some seeds with me of this one, if anybody's interested in trying Udo. I know that there is one plant already in the Hurdal eco-village, somebody called Jorunn Kopper. You know who? You know her? Yeah. She got a plant from me last year and planted it. Yeah. Yeah, it's Udo. It's in the ginseng family, related to ginseng, Aralia cordata. Sometimes the roots of this plant are used as an alternative to ginseng. As I say, it's herbaceous. It dies right back every year and grows to 3 meters or more every summer in the few spring months. Later on, let's see. Yeah, now first, what we use of it is the main part that they use in the Far East are the spring shoots, which are harvested up to about 1 meter high. They're about this much in diameter, so quite thick, and each plant has up to about 30 of these shoots which you can harvest. I don't harvest them all, maybe half of them, and let the others so the plant doesn't get to recover. And one of the easiest ways of using it is basically to cut these shoots off, and basically you peel the outside layer, which is both slightly coarse, or yeah, so it's mainly the coarseness, and then it's just chopped up into small pieces like this, and eaten raw with a simple salad dressing. Typically, again, sesame oil, roasted sesame seeds, and soy sauce. Very simple. Something you can pick and serve within half an hour at home. This is what I call fast, slow food. Yeah.
You always mention this makes so much sense in the early spring. You get lots to harvest.
Yeah.
Does it then make sense to go for fermentation?
Yeah, absolutely.
It does.
This is the way traditional people would preserve the food, both that and drying.
Yeah.
Yeah, of spring harvested vegetables. And the Sami people in Norway, of course, the Laplanders, they did this on a big scale, and I'll come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
These shoots are showing young leaves?
Sorry?
These shoots? Yeah, young leaves? Or?
These are young leaves at the top.
Yeah.
This is the yeah.
Are they a sun-loving plant? Are they a sun-loving plant? Or?
No, it's half shade is the best thing. It's a woodland plant. That's practically all plants in Japan are. So it was covered in forest, you know? So the wild plants are shade lovers. So it's that. You can also use the flower shoots as a kind of broccoli. A bit later on, they use it in tempura. You know what tempura is? Yeah. And one of the main reasons for my trip to Japan was to visit this place here. One of the most unusual production methods for vegetables I've come across is to be found under part of Tokyo. They have a very special type of earth, and they dig these big caverns underneath. Actually, underneath this little forest here, they've dug kind of big caverns underneath the soil, and they move the roots of this huge plant down under the earth, where it's completely dark, and they grow up. It's almost constant temperature of about 18 centigrade, which is recognized to give the highest quality of udo. Now, in Norway, this is maybe a bit different. It's definitely difficult to do in my garden because I don't have more than 15 centimeters of soil anywhere, or 20 centimeters, and it's over rock, you know, so I can't really dig very deep. But so you have to use something. I have used one of these big builder's buckets, murabette, one of the really big ones. So you put it over before the plants start shooting in the early spring, and it grows at an incredible rate in the springtime, and then you see that the buckets is being lifted right up into the sky, and then it's time to harvest. But in Japan, the highest quality udo is underground. So we went down here, and it was amazing to see. And apparently I was the first person from the West to request to go down there, and that was difficult actually. Thanks to Facebook, through a Japanese guy that I knew in the Netherlands, he called the city clerk in this part of Japan and arranged the tour for me. And I had to get a translator, you know, interpreter, and but it was yeah, absolutely fascinating day under Tokyo. And a really nice old guy as well, whose farm it was. And in restaurants, you see udo served here is, this is green udo, which has a stronger taste, and strong tasting plants are most often used in tempura. The tempura kind of disguises the strong taste. Yeah.
How deep was that?
Well, it was maybe 3-4 meters, something like that. Yeah. So, and you saw it was a forest. It's kind of like another layer in the forest garden, underground layer. Potentially.
So that's a strong taste.
The green one has quite a strong taste, so some people find it a bit unpleasant. So blanching or keeping the light away gives a milder taste. But strong tastes, disguising strong tastes is an interesting topic in itself. Like salad dressing was originally was used because a lot of the herbs in salads were quite bitter tasting. Yeah. So the oil and the vinegar actually cover your tongue, and so that you don't detect the bitter taste as strongly. But nowadays it's almost superfluous because most of our vegetables are mild tasting, sweet. You know. So lettuce or salat was originally a bitter herb. You know. We have rucola, which has become very popular, amazingly, strangely. It became really, really popular. Maybe because we have an innate desire for these stronger tastes that we're kind of lacking in today's diet. And chicory as well, chicory, is becoming more and more popular. Another quite bitter herb. Anyway, I digress. A relation to same family as the last one is what we call devil's walking stick, or angelica tree in England. Fandenspaserstokk in Norway, which is, I was in Hamar yesterday and I was staying with a guy who had one of these in his garden. So they're quite hardy, quite frequently grown in southwestern Norway, Stavanger area, etc. It's actually a small tree, so it's not a herbaceous perennial like the last one, Udo. And this is also hugely important in Japan. They use the young shoots or the young leaves that come out in the very, very early spring. Here is actually udo, very young shoots at ground level, which are also used in a similar way, often in tempura or many other dishes. And that was also seen in all the saw that also in all the supermarkets, typically like this in the springtime. Taranomi, the name was. So very popular there. And a very nice tree to have, I think, in a forest garden, in addition to, so this is a tree with edible leaves, edible young leaves. And it's called, yeah, of course, the reason it's called devil's walking stick, because when it's a young tree, the stem is covered in big thorns, so it's difficult to grasp. Ja. Ja, snart. Vi är färdig med Japan. Ja. Ja, I'll be older färdig, so I'm never finished with this talk, so yeah, just relax. Just kick me out when you're finished. Yeah, the next one is is actually from Korea. The story is from Korea. A very important vegetable is an aster. We know the asters as again as ornamentals in our garden. This one isn't very commonly grown in Scandinavia, but it could well be grown because it's a fantastic ornamental plant in the autumn when it's looking like that in September. It's one of the most beautiful plants in my garden at that time of year. But it's the young shoots again that you harvest. Hugely important in Korea, and they grow this plant for the markets in the cities because it's previously a forage plant, there's a big demand for in the cities, and they also dry the leaves and export to the markets in North America. Yeah, it's a fantastic plant, and I was actually contacted by a Korean woman in Oslo about 5-6 years ago. She been been, I think, a refugee to Norway, maybe in the Korean War or something at that stage. She'd just recently retired, got a small cabin out in the woods with a little piece of land, and she still remembered when she was living in Korea as a 10-year-old, going out foraging with her grandmother. And one of the plants she remembered was this one here. She'd searched everywhere to try and find seed so that she could grow this, and you know how you remember taste way back, you know? And she searched everywhere, and then suddenly she found this strange Englishman up in Trondheim who had seed on his seed list, because I mainly get hold of plant material from trading on the internet. So I make a seed list every year, and that year this plant was, I had seed of this plant on my seed list. And so I sent her seed, and yeah, I learned a lot from her. And she was so pleased that she knitted these socks for me. Isn't that nice? It's my best trade ever, I think. And other asters around the world, in North America, for the Native Americans, they used Aster macrophyllum, big leaf aster. And we even have one in Europe, which has become quite popular, and a very common plant, which you probably all recognise who've been on next to the sea in Norway. This is Strandstjerne in Norwegian, or sea aster in English. And it basically, when it's flowering from midsummer up until August, you see this stripe of colour from the flowers. There are no records, as far as I know, of use of this plant as a food in Norway, and in around about the early 2000s, this plant was chosen as the kommuneblomst, the flower of my commune. I was called by the local newspaper, Nyttevekstforening, what they thought about the choice of this one as our local flower, and is it edible, because they knew I had this strange interest in weird edible plants. I had heard at the time that it was used as a kind of survival food, etc. But just to check, I looked on the internet, I did a quick search, and within a very short space of time I found out that this plant was under extensive, it was being researched in several EU projects looking for novel vegetables to be grown on land which was too salty. And already at that time in the Netherlands, where they have a big problem with salty land because of the salt water coming in the low lying, it was already being sold as gourmet food in restaurants in the Netherlands. Amazing. And nowadays, I believe it's being grown in several other areas. Not only because of the salt water coming in from the sea, but because of intensive agriculture around the world and irrigation. The water evaporates and it leaves salt behind. So there's large areas of land, agricultural land, that are too salty to grow the conventional crops. So looking at alternatives which are so-called halophytes or salt-tolerant plants. And these are plants which often grow on the beaches. Another one, which is several of you will probably recognise as a garden flower in Norway, is what we call Korea-nøkketunge. This is what they call a species Ligularia fischeri from Korea. Also a very important vegetable, which is also grown in glass houses there. The young shoots are eaten, food. Later in the summer, you get these yellow. Anybody recognise this as a garden plant? Often found in old gardens in Norway. Not this species. Other species are a bit. This one has a very mild taste. Other species can be quite bitter. So don't eat any old Ligularia or Nøkketunge. And it's also a woodland plant, and these are just a few pictures of them growing for production in Korea. and they're used in different ways. These here are being sold as wraps for food. So they have the food up in the leaf, and the leaves are edible, raw. And here, top right, just used as a vegetable. You can see it's full of good stuff. It looks a bit like kale or something, you know, very dark. And here's a picture of a wrap as they serve it in Japan, in Korea. In the Far East, I love my onions. I have maybe 400 different types of onions in my garden, and there is always an onion flowering in my garden, right from the beginning of April to October. A fascinating family, huge diversity, and all of them can be eaten, even the ornamental ones. Some of them are a bit strong tasting, so if they're too strong, don't bother, but you can try any of them. In the Far East, it's unlike in Europe, where we mostly cultivate Allium Pipeløk in Norwegian, the bulb onion. In the Far East, it's mainly Pipeløk, or Welsh onion, Allium fistulosum, which is grown. And there are many different varieties. Allium fistulosum originates in Siberia and is a very hardy plant originally. Here is from actually just from a supermarket in Japan, 8 different varieties of this plant. Before the last war in Norway, actually was Pipeløk Welsh onion was grown on quite a big scale. About that time, Pipeløk, Allium Pipeløk came to Norway. So before that time, it was shallot and Pipeløk that were grown. And there's a huge amount of food in a plant grown as a perennial. So everything there can be used. This is from the botanical gardens in Oslo. And can be grown more or less anywhere in Norway. And we have a really old tradition in Norway of growing onions on roofs. You know about this? This is Gudbrandsdalen, around Otta. There are about 8 of these old roofs which still exist, and they're all now protected by law. So it's not allowed to go and start eating these, no? But some of them are on the way out, unfortunately. But and they were grown on these roofs both because the leaves are succulent, so it was kind of fire protection, but it had a double role that they could also be harvested for food in the springtime. And this lady here told us that her grandmother ordered her husband up onto the roof every spring to harvest the onions for a scrambled egg array. And the environment on these roofs is totally extreme. And in fact, you'll find that the onions, you'll only find them on the south-facing part of the roof. On the other part of the roof, the grasses win the battle. On the south-facing part, which is driest, warmest, and very cold in winter, potentially, the onions grow. So these are incredibly hardy plants, and they've been growing on these roofs for such a long time that some botanists in Norway think that a new species has actually evolved on these roofs. So we can call it Allium gudbrandalensis. Yeah, just quickly over another one we saw a lot of in production in Japan. It's Japanese parsley, mitsuba, which you can find in vegetable catalogues. It's also perennial. It's a very nice red-leaved form, which I grow in my garden, and it's reliably perennial. The leaves don't taste at all like. It's also in the carrot family, like parsley, but the leaves don't taste at all like parsley. They have a completely different taste. Tastes to me a bit like sushi or something, something Japanese. So perfect there. Okay, we go on. Wasabi we've already talked about, so we won't dwell on that. getting behind on time here, and I did actually grow wasabi in my garden for 6 years, and this was the total crop I managed to get.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was delicious. Great to have a Malvik wasabi one year.
Did it perish?
It's hardy, and you can also use the leaves and the flowers. They're very tasty as well.
But the plant, did it collapse? Did it just...
One year it did die. I'm not sure if it was because I'd harvested the root. Possibly, but yeah. But they are quite hardy, and there are actually, normally they're grown in, we visited a wasabi farm, and they're grown in running water, literally. But there are dry land forms of wasabi also, so it's worth trying to get hold of one of them if you want to try it. But it has very, very narrow ecological conditions that are perfect for producing the roots. Like the water has to be about 13, 14 centigrade the whole year. So it's spring water from the mountains.
Er det samme som løkert? Den ligner så litt.
No, det er ikke løkert, men it's related to løkert, yeah, or hedge garlic, as it's called, Alliaria. Alliaria, that plant is annual, whereas this is a perennial. Yeah, and that's what the roots are supposed to look like under proper conditions. And you can also find the leaf shoots being sold as food in supermarkets. And as you mentioned, it's not wasabi. If you've been to a sushi restaurant and had wasabi paste, it's nothing to do with wasabi. It's a very expensive production. So they use horseradish and mustard and food colouring to make it look like. So you're fooled. Yeah. And then we have this one here. If you can't beat it, eat it. Parks lyricnea, or Japanese knotweed, is a hugely invasive plant, blacklisted plant in Norway. In Japan it's called Itadori, which literally means the strong one, because it can break its way through asphalt, for example. But it's a lot of negative things are written about this plant, but it's actually a fantastic edible. Yeah. No, it's a really tall plant which can grow to 3-4 meters in the summer, and some people call it bamboo. So it kind of looks a bit like bamboo, but it's on the Norwegian blacklist. Plant you're not allowed to, shouldn't plant, or it's unwanted, and there's a lot of Roundup on it, etc. But don't do that, eat it instead. If we ate more of it, then it wouldn't be such a problem. And in fact, you harvest them about this stage. You can use them just like rhubarb, and use them in the same dishes you use rhubarb in, as a kind of a slightly lemony taste. And or you can just use it as a vegetable. And it contains a well-known antioxidant called resveratrol, if I say that correctly, which is apparently the same antioxidant you find in red wine. So if you make a Japanese knotweed pie and then have a glass of red wine next to you, you're guaranteed to live to 100 years. No, I'm joking, but actually this plant is grown commercially to produce resveratrol, this antioxidant, which is sold internationally in the markets. And this is the distribution of it in Norway. So we're not going to get rid of it. It's here to stay. Yeah. And in fact, it seems to be more common here. That I didn't see it actually that much in Japan. Saw it a few places, but that's it. And almost finished now with Japan. We have Sturtevant, or ostrich fern in English. Let's see what's happening here. Yeah, the slides are slightly different because I've made some last minute differences, and I'm running off this stick, which was an earlier version. Never mind. But ostrich fern, yeah, has become known. Many people here have eaten ostrich fern. Actually, quite a few. Yeah. Ostrich fern is Norway's largest fern. It can be higher than me where it grows in good conditions, and it often forms really large stands. It spreads vegetatively, so that what you see as thousands of plants can actually just be one plant, so connected by rhizomes. You have to be absolutely certain that it is ostrich fern, so it's good to go out with somebody who knows their plants, because it can be confused with poisonous ferns. But ostrich fern has traditionally been used around the world, both in Japan, in the Far East, also in North America. It was a Native American vegetable which the Europeans learnt, and today something like 1,000 tons of these very small so-called fiddleheads are harvested in the springtime and sold as gourmet food. The taste is excellent, a bit like a mixture of beans and various other vegetables. A bit distinctive, but everybody I know that's tried it have loved it. Important to cook for about 15 minutes, because often where you collect them are along rivers which flood in the winter, and floodwaters can bring with them some nasties. So make sure you cook for 15 minutes, but the taste is still great after that time. Also, often grown as an ornamental in gardens around the world, and it's a rather stately looking plant. And it's important, one very important character that compared with other ferns, that it has two different types of leaf. It has these very large summer leaves which are green. There are no spores behind the leaves, and there are secondary smaller leaves which are about this high, which you don't see in the summer. They're hidden by the big green leaves, which are dark and they're covered in spores. And these stand over the entire winter, and then the spores are released in the springtime with the floodwaters, etc. When the snow's melting, etc. So this is the only one you're likely to find in this area with two different leaves like this. So get to know it before you try it. Distribution in Norway. In fact, Norway has even larger stands of ostrich fern in North America. Despite that, it's until recent years, it's hardly anybody that has known it as an edible plant. And traditionally, we only have one record of ferns being eaten for food, back in, I think, in the 16th century or something. So, huge amount of food to chew, and it grows right the way to the far north. So it's a very, very hardy plant. And again, in Japan, in the supermarkets, every supermarket had ostrich fern for sale. Very popular. Okay, shall we hop over Malva? Alpha. We had alpha sprouts for breakfast, but actually the plant itself, which is lucerne, which is well known as probably the world's most important fodder crop for animals, is actually used as a perennial vegetable also for humans in China. So you can actually grow lucerne in Norway as a perennial, and you can harvest the young shoots in the springtime. There's the sprouts. There's the sprouts we had at Berwick's place for breakfast. No, yes, yeah, that one. Yeah, it's a pea family, yes. So it's very good for that as well. But it's difficult to produce the seeds, unfortunately.
I have beans. Does that help?
Apparently it needs a special insect, which does the pollination, so which they introduce where they're producing the seeds. And then we have garlic chives, which is also very important in the Far East. Another beautiful autumn flowering onion, which I won't go into detail. Can also use, you can find, this is actually bought in a Chinese supermarket in Oslo. So there are certain varieties which are bred for succulent flower stalks, which are used in food. And then we have daylily, which is another very important, along with Hosta, probably number 2, as far as the most popular ornamental plants in the world. Again, with tens of thousands of varieties. But this is actually one of the oldest vegetables that are known, going back several thousand years in China, used as a food plant. And it's both the young leaves in the springtime, but mainly the flower buds. The flowers can be used in salad, as long as you don't eat 40, 50 of them, in which case you might get a bad stomach. But in small amounts you can use the flowers in salads. And actually the day after the flowers, they come out, they wither, and they collect the withered flowers, dry them, and use them as a kind of use them in soups as a flavouring during the winter months. So here you have a plant where you can enjoy the flower and also harvest. It's quite nice. It's mainly the simple yellow varieties which are grown in the Far East. These have very big flowers, as you can see, so they're quite productive. And this is a daylily farm in Taiwan. This could be Norway if we wanted to. It's a totally hardy plant. And here I have a picture from the botanical garden in Oslo, where they've kindly put out snacks besides the pictures. In the woodlands in Japan, you see Hemerocallis or daylily growing everywhere. It's very early spring, so no flowers, of course. So this is all food. You can see there. Yeah, I think I just pass over these few here because we're going to run out of time. Just show you this Japanese water dropwort, seri, very important. Yeah. It's time for a pause. Japanese Japan pesterot, the fuki, super important vegetable in Japan. You also see in all the supermarkets. They use both the flower buds and the flower stems. This is an invasive plant in Norway, which is found in various parts of Norway, escaped from gardens. Yeah. And yeah, just a few pictures showing it being used.
But we don't see the pictures.
Oh, you don't see the pictures at all, sorry about that.
Perhaps if you are on the other side.
From the other side, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. Yeah, and this last one was one of the last days I was in Japan. I was in a soba restaurant, which is a buckwheat pasta restaurant, which are you find all over Japan. And this was a very special one because he was growing all his vegetables in his garden around the restaurant. So this garden here was full of edibles, including Oster shoots, Orcasnella, you know this? Equisatum, very popular vegetable there. They use it a lot. Again, you see that in all the supermarkets. And the big surprise, the one that the most extreme vegetable I ate there was actually a elder, Sambucus hood. This was a red-berried hood, and they were actually eating the leaves and the flowers.
Wow.
I survived. Yeah, so I guess so, but I thought the green leaves were also quite a bit toxic, but obviously not as much as I think. Yeah, yeah, you can. Yeah, the flowers you can, but it was the leaves, the green leaves, that I was a bit surprised at. You know. Okay, shall we take a little break? Happy so far?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hvor lenge blir det?